This morning, something landed on my desk that made me pause. A 20-year energy procurement contract signed not in Washington but in Vancouver. On May 27, 2026, Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Tim Hodgson, finalised a deal with SEF, Germany's state-owned energy utility, securing 1 million tonnes of Canadian liquefied natural gas annually. The delivery point is the C-Silcium's export terminal on the coast of British Columbia, with full-scale operations targeted for the early 2030s. This is not merely a commercial transaction. It is the first formal breach in the wall of American energy hegemony over Europe. To understand why this move sent a chill through the halls of the White House, we have to look at the math of dependency. In 2025, the United States accounted for 96% of Germany's LNG imports. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of a deliberate, calculated strategy by the Trump administration to solidify an energy dominance doctrine. By replacing Russian pipeline gas with American LNG, Washington secured more than just market share. It secured a lever of statecraft. When the United States supplies 96% of a major power's energy, it gains the power to influence that nation's trade, defense, and foreign policy through the simple threat of redirected supply. But leverage only functions when the target has no alternatives. For 4 years, Berlin watched as the US weaponized trade tariffs against both Germany and Canada. In February 2025, the Trump administration slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, an act that shattered the illusion of a monolithic North American trade bloc. European observers watched the US-Canada trade confrontation with growing alarm. They saw a Washington that was no longer a reliable partner, but an unpredictable actor willing to use economic coercion against its own closest allies. Germany realized that replacing a Moscow-controlled pipeline with a Washington-controlled tanker fleet was not energy security. It was a transition from one form of vulnerability to another. The Silciums project, therefore, is Germany's hedge. Located on the northwest coast of British Columbia and developed in partnership with the Nizhgar Nation, this facility is being architected to be structurally resistant to the whims of the American executive branch. When SEF signed this 20-year commitment, they were not chasing marginal pricing advantages. They were executing sovereign energy policy by diversifying its supply base, splitting its dependency between the US, Gulf Coast, Qatar, and now the Pacific coast of Canada. Germany is fundamentally recalibrating its risk profile. The geopolitical sequencing here is critical. In 2022, Chancellor Olaf Scholz came to Canada begging for LNG, only to be sent home with nothing but a hydrogen-flavoured photo op. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau famously declared that there was no business case for such an investment. But that was before the US turned its trade policy into a blunt instrument of warfare. It was before Iran disrupted Qatari supply lines in early 2026, forcing a global scramble for geographically secure, non-Middle Eastern energy. The Canada that signed the CEF deal today is a different actor than the one that stood on the sidelines 4 years ago. The shift is systemic, with the federal government granting national priority status to the C-Silciums terminal and the project clearing its environmental hurdles in record time. Canada has moved from a passive energy provider to an active strategic competitor. The implications for the White House are immediate and severe. Washington's energy dominance strategy rested on the assumption that no democratic alternative to US gas existed. That assumption has just been invalidated. The Silciums deal signals to every European capital that there is a viable, democratic and geographically secure path to decoupling from US-controlled supply chains. However, a massive logistical gap remains. The terminal is not yet built. The final investment decision is still pending. The regulatory and financial architectures are being assembled in real time under intense scrutiny from environmental groups and local stakeholders. Canada has secured the signature of Europe's largest economy, but it has not yet secured the physical capacity to deliver the molecules. The question is no longer whether Europe wants to diversify. The question is whether Canada can deliver the infrastructure fast enough to prevent a total lock-in to the American model before the window for energy autonomy closes for good. The ink on that Vancouver contract is barely dry, yet the structural implications are already reverberating through the global energy markets. To understand why this deal is a pivot point rather than a routine procurement, we have to pull apart the architecture of the Che Silciums project, what it is, who owns it, and why it changes the leverage calculation in Berlin first. Let's look at the project itself. Silciums, meaning from the Nass River in the Nisga'a language, is not a traditional, state-run industrial monolith. It is a joint venture between the Nisga'a Nation, the Rockies LNG Limited Partnership, and Houston-based Western LNG. By housing this on Nisga'a Treaty Land, the project bypasses the typical jurisdictional paralysis that has historically hamstrung Canadian energy development. It is a sovereign, Indigenous-led initiative, granted national priority status by the federal government under the One Project, One Review model. When Minister Tim Hodgson fast-tracked this through the environmental assessment process in September 2025, he wasn't just clearing a path for a terminal. He was creating a bypass for the regulatory gridlock that once made Canadian exports a pipe dream. Canada.ca is show 1 second. Consider the financial architecture. At a projected cost of $10 billion, Silciums is designed to be a net zero facility, powered by 600 megawatts from British Columbia's hydroelectric grid. This is a crucial detail. By hooking directly into the BC Hydro transmission line, the project effectively weaponizes Canada's clean energy surplus against the high-carbon, legacy export models used by US Gulf Coast competitors. This isn't just about moving molecules, it is about marketing a lower carbon intensity product to an EU market that is increasingly punishing high-emission imports with internal regulatory costs. CBC third, look at the supply offtake. The 1 million tonnes secured by the German state utility SEF. Securing energy for Europe is a massive validation of this specific model. SEF is the entity that replaced Gazprom after the 2022 energy shocks. They are not acting as a private speculator looking for a quick profit margin. They are the literal manifestation of German state energy policy. By committing to a 20-year term, SEF is signalling to the global financial community that Canadian LNG is a bankable, long-term cornerstone of European energy stability. They are effectively underwriting the project's future viability. The deal's structure also includes significant flexibility. Unlike the rigid, long-term contracts of the past, this agreement is designed to operate within a global swap architecture. If the logistics of shipping from the Pacific prove temporarily suboptimal, SEF and their Canadian partners can leverage global trading networks to facilitate the delivery of equivalent supply, ensuring that the contractual obligation is met regardless of immediate physical transit conditions. This is the sophisticated, high-speed trading reality that many analysts, fixated on the traditional pipeline-to-port narrative, have entirely missed. But the most critical piece of this architecture is the partner alignment. With TotalEnergies and Shell already holding multi-million-tonne offtake agreements, 5 million of the project's 12 million tonnes of annual capacity are effectively spoken for before the first shovel hits the ground on Pearce Island. This has shifted the risk profile for every lender involved. When a project reaches this level of secured demand, it ceases to be a speculative development and becomes a critical piece of international infrastructure. The White House, which built its energy dominance doctrine on the idea that Europe had nowhere else to turn, is now looking at a very different math. They aren't just competing with Canada, they are competing with a coalition of European state utilities and Indigenous nations who have fundamentally decided that Washington is no longer a safe place to anchor their national security. However, even with the contracts signed and the regulatory hurdles cleared, the project faces a final, brutal reality. Securing the buyers was the easy part. Building the physical terminal, expanding the North Coast transmission line, and successfully navigating the local opposition to the Prince Rupert Gas transmission pipeline are the real tests. The clock is ticking toward that 2032 operational target, and in the world of high-stakes global energy, time is the one variable that no amount of diplomatic manoeuvring can replace. The SEF Canada agreement is not just a contract, it is a structural decoupling. By moving from a state of total reliance on American energy to a diversified, multipolar supply strategy, Germany has effectively signaled that the era of US energy dominance as a geopolitical lever is in its twilight. We are watching the end of the post-2022 status quo. For 4 years, Washington relied on the assumption that its control over the North American energy tap, facilitated by massive liquefaction expansion in the Gulf, gave it a permanent, structural advantage over Europe. But the sheer volatility of the current US trade policy, marked by the ongoing 35% tariff regime and the threat of CUSMA abandonment, has turned that perceived advantage into a strategic liability. Europe's largest economy has now concluded that the risk of a political molecular embargo from Washington is greater than the cost of funding new, democratic, geographically secure supply chains in the Pacific. This shift carries profound implications for the broader Atlantic alliance. We are witnessing the re-emergence of an independent European foreign policy that prioritizes strategic autonomy over mere adherence to a Washington-centric framework. When Germany, a country once so dependent on Moscow and then so tethered to the US Gulf Coast, chooses to anchor its energy future to the Nass River in British Columbia, it is stating clearly that it no longer trusts the US to act as a stable, predictable, or benevolent hegemon. Canada is no longer the silent partner or the next state over. It is becoming a critical node in a new, more resilient global energy architecture. Cheminalist, the contrast with the pre-Trump era is stark. In the early 2020s, the US-Canada-Europe relationship was defined by integration and a shared sense of transatlantic security. Today, it is defined by a frantic scramble for self-preservation. Canada's pivot toward doubling non-US trade is no longer a political aspiration. It is an economic survival mandate driven by a White House that has proven willing to sacrifice its longest-standing trade relationships for the sake of short-term, zero-sum domestic political wins. But do not mistake this move for a total break from the past. The infrastructure gaps are real, the environmental hurdles are high, and the project is still at least 6 years away from delivering its first cargo. The real battle now is not in the negotiation rooms of Berlin or the boardrooms of Vancouver, it is on the ground. Whether this project succeeds or stalls will depend entirely on the capacity of the federal government to push through the final investment decision in the face of intense domestic opposition and the looming uncertainty of the 2026 CAESME review. The next critical juncture arrives this July, when the trilateral review of North American trade enters its formal phase, with the US administration openly musing about letting the current trade pact expire. The Canada-Germany deal acts as a silent, powerful warning. If Washington chooses to treat its neighbours as adversaries, it will find itself increasingly isolated from the very global markets it once sought to dominate. Since the chessboard is moving, Europe is placing its bets